Should a person ever be rebaptized? That's an important question to ask, and it seems to me that there's usually one of three motivations behind this question. So we could kind of group these under the three R's. And a big one is recommitment. And this is the idea that a person has, maybe they were raised in church, but in high school or in college or maybe after college, they drifted away from the church. And now, thanks be to God, they've come back and they want to show their recommitment to Christ by getting rebaptized. So that's one motivation behind this. Another is responsibility. And by that I mean a person, maybe they were baptized as an infant or a child, maybe they don't even remember their baptism. But now that they're a responsible adult, they want to be rebaptized now that they can make that decision and remember this act. So sometimes it's recommitment, sometimes it's responsibility, sometimes it's relocation. And by that I mean they have relocated to a different denomination. There are some Christian traditions which either ask or require a person to be baptized within that particular denomination, even if the person has come from another Christian tradition. Now, there might be other motivations behind a person wanting to be rebaptized, but that seems to be the three big R's: recommitment, responsibility, or relocation. So, what's the answer? Should a person ever be rebaptized? Well, to get to an answer to that, and just to kind of let you know ahead of time, I think the answer to both of these possibilities is going to be no. But to get to a question, to get to an answer, first of all, we're kind of at a crossroads because we have to go down one or two different roads. Now, this is maybe too general, but it seems to me that there's one of two ways that you can go with regard to baptism in all the various traditions that are out there. And whether you go one way or whether you go another way is largely determined by the answer that you give to this question: who is doing the work in baptizing? Who is the subject and who is the object? Who is the one doing the verbs in baptism? So again, this is kind of the crossroads question, and it takes you down one or two different ways. So there are many traditions out there which basically focus upon baptism is something that you do for God. So it's a way of committing your life to Him. It's an outward symbol of this commitment to Him, an act of obedience. These are various ways in which this particular perspective on baptism is described. And there the focus is mainly upon you. Baptism is an expression of this obedience, this fidelity, this commitment to God. That's one direction that many Christian traditions go down with regard to baptism. Now, that's not my own, but many do hold that. The other perspective, the other teaching is that baptism is something that God does for you. And that is what I hold to be true, that God is the one who does the baptizing. God is the one who is the active agent in baptism. And in this act of baptizing, God is giving His gifts of Jesus to the person who is baptized. So, who is doing the work in baptism? That question is going to send us down one of two roads. However, I think either way you go, the answer to the question, should you be rebaptized, is a resounding and an absolute no, you should not. So let's say that you're from a tradition, or you individually believe that baptism is something that you do for God. Should you be rebaptized? Well, no, because number one, there is no biblical precedent for rebaptizing. In fact, it's quite to the contrary. Paul says in Ephesians 4:5, there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. There's not multiple baptisms. There's no biblical precedent where a person was baptized, and I'm talking about baptism in water, baptized in water, and in a Christian baptism, and then, for whatever reason, was baptized later in a second or third baptism. There's no precedent for that whatsoever. And there's no biblical verse which either calls for rebaptism or endorses any kind of rebaptism. So even if you believe, I do not, but even if you believe that baptism is primarily something you do for God, then there's no biblical precedent for a rebaptism. There's no biblical verse for a rebaptism. And so should you be rebaptized? No, you should not. Now, I don't go down that road. I go down the road which understands that baptism is something which God does for us. He's the subject and we are the object. He is the doer, the giver, and we are the one being done to. We are the receiver. In fact, the way that we even talk about baptism accentuates the passive nature of the one who is baptized. Think about it. No one baptizes himself or herself. Instead, we are baptized by the hand of someone else. Sometimes it's a priest or a pastor or a parent or someone else. But people don't baptize themselves. They are baptized. They receive this baptism by the hand of someone else. Now, the one doing the baptizing is basically standing in the stead of Christ himself. So we would say that Christ is the baptizer. He's the one who is doing the baptizing. And then we who are receiving this are the baptized. He's the active agent. We are passively receiving what God has done for us. And so what is God doing in baptism? Well, he's giving all of the gifts that he desires us to receive in Jesus by means of not just simple water, not just ordinary water, but water that is connected with, that we might say is empowered by the Word of God. One of my pastors liked to say it's in simple water and strong Word that God uses baptism to give to us the gifts of Jesus. So, if that is one's perspective, one's belief about baptism, which it is for me, then should a rebaptism ever take place? Absolutely not. Never in any circumstance whatsoever. Why? Because what God does for us in baptism, he does perfectly. God doesn't mess things up when he does things. So when God baptizes us, that baptism is whole, pure, perfect, divine, because God is the one doing the actions. Now, you and I, we have to redo a lot of things because we mess it up. Maybe we're building something and we mess it up, we got to start over. Maybe we're writing something, we mess it up, we have to start over. Maybe we're doing math, we mess up, we got to start the equation over. We mess up all the time. And so there's a lot of redos in our life because we're the one doing the actions. And since we're not perfect, we mess a lot of things up. So we have to start over, a restart, a redo. Not God. When God does what he does for us, he does it perfectly. And so when he baptizes us, there's no need for a rebaptism. He did it perfectly the first time. Secondly, the way I like to put this is the water baptism never evaporates. It always stays on us. It doesn't matter if you were baptized as an infant. It doesn't matter if you were baptized at the age of 5 or 15 or 50, whatever it is, that water baptism remains on you. And this is connected with my first point, that God is the one doing the baptism. So what God does, he does perfectly. And what God does, that baptismal water he puts on us remains on us. And for that reason, even though we can talk about how when we were baptized, that is pinpointing a certain date on the calendar, on this day I was baptized, truly, we use the present tense. We don't say I was baptized, we say I am baptized. So just like I was married on a certain day to my wife, but I don't say I was married, I say I am married. The marriage began at a certain date, yes, but this continues to define who I am vocationally. I'm a husband to her. Similarly, I was baptized on a certain date, and I am baptized because what God did for me then remains just as true as the day in which he first did it. So the water baptism never evaporates. And then finally, what happens when we go astray from God, as I did in my mid-30s, I strayed from God. I went into a life of darkness and rebellion, kind of like the prodigal son. God, thanks be to him, brought me back home to himself. But when he did, I didn't seek rebaptism. I didn't want to repeat baptism. I simply returned to the reality that my baptism had established for me. I didn't repeat baptism. I returned to that. Meaning, I came to God in confession, in repentance, and in faith. I was brought back. I say I returned. It's more like God brought me back to the baptism that he had done perfectly. I came home to who God had made me to be in Jesus Christ. And for those of you who may be watching this and have gone the way the prodigal son yourself, and thanks be to God, have come back to the church and are thinking about being rebaptized, there's no need for that. You return to your original baptism, the one that God did perfectly when he baptized you the first time. So let me throw one more scenario out there that perhaps can be confusing for people. There are individuals who were brought up in a community, a spiritual community, a religious community that engaged in what they call baptisms, but this religious community denied the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, in the Christian confession, you can't deny the doctrine of the Trinity and be within the Christian church. So, anything that is done within a community such as that, which denies the Trinity, cannot be Christian. So they can engage in what they refer to as a baptism, but it is not a baptism. Because that community is not a Christian community, it cannot be a Christian baptism, no matter what the words are that are used. Now, if a person raised in a religious community such as that, and who had undergone something that looked a lot like baptism, now believes in Jesus Christ, has come to faith, is part of the Christian church, and wants to be baptized, yes, absolutely, let that person be baptized. But it's not a rebaptism, because what happened the first time in a religious community which denied the doctrine of the Trinity cannot be baptism. So sometimes that kind of language is used. Well, I'm going to be rebaptized because I'm now a member of the Christian church. No, you're not. You're going to be baptized for the first time. God is going to do it right this first time, and that one baptism is going to remain with you for the rest of your life. So that's some thoughts on baptism and rebaptism. The long and the short of it is, should a person ever be rebaptized? No, because it can't be done. It's factually impossible, because God does baptism once, he does it perfectly, and it cannot be repeated. So thanks be to God for baptism. Thanks be to God for the gift of baptism. And thanks be to God that baptism is something that does not need to be repeated, because God did it perfectly the first time. Thanks for watching the video. If you like it, pass it on to your friends, and give my channel a like and a follow. I'd appreciate it. And peace be with you all.